Chapter 8 of Blackbeard, Buccaneer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carlos Recio. Titled by Ralph D. Paine. Chapter 8. The Episode of the Winding Creek. The singular discovery of Bill Saxby's jacket was like a shock to drive all else out of their minds. Now they found that it had been thrown over a jug of water and a bag of beef and biscuit stowed in the bow. This solved one pressing problem, and they nibbled the hard ration while debating the situation. It was agreed that they could not honorably run away with the pirogue if it really belonged to Stede Bonnet's men, who must have come on foot along the higher ground back of the coast and descended the creek in the canoe stolen or purchased from Indians met by chance. Granted this much, it was fair to conjecture that Captain Bonnet's ship was in some harbor not many leagues distant, and that he knew where to find Blackbeard's rendezvous at Cherokee Inlet. "'Tis your job to stand by the pirogue, Jack," suggested Hawkridge, "and I will make a sally towards the pirates' camp before they rouse out." "Go softly, Joe, and don't be reckless. Why not lie up till night before you reconnoiter?" "'Cause the mist still hangs heavy, and I'm blowed if I dilly-dally if good Bill Saxby has come to grief." "Supposing he has, you cannot wrest him single-handed from Blackbeard's crew." "Well, if I can but slip a word of comfort in his ear, it'll cheer him mightily, unless his throat be cut by now," was the stubborn response. "Sit thee taut, Jack, old camarada, and chuck the worry. Care kill the cat. These rogues yonder in the camp won't molest me if I walk boldly amongst them." "What if you don't return?" persisted Jack. "How long shall I wait here with the pirogue?" "Now what the deuce can I say to such foolish queries? If things go wrong with me and Bill and his mate, you will have to cruise alone or hop back to the Revenge." With a laugh and a wave of the hand, the dauntless adventurer leaped from the nose of the canoe, nimbly hauled himself into a tree, and then plunged into the gloomy swamp, where he was speedily lost to view. Jack Cockerell settled himself to wait, for he knew not what. Clouds of midges and mosquitoes tormented him, and he ached with fatigue. Soon after sunrise, the mist began to burn away, and the mouth of the creek was no longer obscured by shadows. In the glare of day, Jack thought it likely that the canoe might be detected by some pair of keen eyes aboard the Revenge. To move it far might imperil Joe Hawkridge and Bonnet's two seamen should they come in haste with a hue and cry behind them. Jack paddled the pirogue up the creek and soon found a safe ambuscade, a stagnant cove in among the dense growth, where he tied up to a gnarled root. Then he climbed a wide-branching oak and propped himself in a crotch from which he could see the open water and the two vessels at anchor. Clumps of taller trees cut off any view of the beach and the camp, but he dared stray no farther from the pirogue. Tediously, an hour passed, and there was no sign of Joe Hawkridge. He had a journey of only a few hundred yards to make, and Jack began to imagine all kinds of misfortune that might have befallen him, such as being mired beyond his depth in the swamp, and perishing miserably. The sensible conclusion was, however, that he had tarried among his shipmates in the camp with some shrewd purpose in mind. A little later in the morning, Jack's anxious cogitations were diverted by the frequent passage of boats between the Revenge and the sloop which was anchored near the beach. One of these small craft was Blackbeard's own cockboat, or captain's gig, which he used for errands in smooth water, with a couple of men to pull it. Jack was reminded of that secret conference in the cabin, and Joe's conviction that some uncommon devilment was afoot. It appeared as though Tallow Dick Spender, that unwholesome master of the Triumph sloop, had been chosen as the right bower. And now there arose a sudden and riotous noise in the camp. It was not the mirth and song of jolly pirates a-pleasuring ashore, but the ferocious tumult of men in conflict and taken unawares. Perched in the tree, Jack Cockerell listened, all agog, as the sounds rose and fell with the breeze, which swayed the long grey moss that draped the branches. He heard a few pistol shots, and then was startled to see a spurt of flame dart from a gun port of the sloop. The dull report reached him an instant later. He could see that the gun had been fired from the vessel's shoreward battery. It meant that Blackbeard was making a target of some part of the camp. Another gun belched its cloud of smoke. The noise died down, save for intermittent shouts and one long wail of anguish. Presently a boat moved out past the sloop. A dozen men tugged at the oars, and others stood crowded in the stern sheets. Jack caught the gleam of weapons, and thought he recognized the squat, broad figure of Blackbeard himself beside the man at the steering oar. Behind this pinnace from the Revenge trailed two other boats in tow. They passed in slow procession, out between the vessels. The boats which the pinnace towed were not empty. Instead of sitting upon the thwarts, men seemed to be strewn about in them as if they had been tossed over the gunwales like so much dunnage. Jack rubbed his eyes in amazement and watched the line of boats turn to follow the channel which led out of a sheltered roadstead to the sea beyond. When they vanished beyond a sandy island, the lad of the live oak tree said to himself, "My guess is that Blackbeard has put a stopper on all talk of mutiny by one bold stroke, a bloody weeding out, and in those 2 boats are the poor wretches who were taken alive. Alas, one of them may be Joe Hawkridge, unless he be dead already. He talked too much of Stede Bonnet aboard the ship, and there were sneaking dogs in the crew who spied on their comrades. We saw them enter the cabin last night." There was no getting around the evidence. It fitted together all too well. Jack sadly reflected that, beyond a doubt, he had seen the last of gallant, loyal Joe Hawkridge. Left alone with a pirogue, which he could not paddle single-handed, it was folly to think of trying to escape along the coast. And to wander inland, ignorant of the country, was to court almost certain death. Nor could he now expect mercy from Blackbeard, having deserted the ship against orders, and known to be a true friend of Captain Stede Bonnet. The most unhappy lad could no longer hold his cramped station in the tree, and he decided to seek the canoe and find the meager solace of a little food and water. He was halfway to the ground when he clutched a limb and halted to peer into the swamp. Something was splashing through the mud and grass and making a prodigious fuss about it. Then Jack heard 2 voices, in grunts and maledictions. Fearing the enemy might have tracked him, he stood as still as a mouse in the leafage of the oak. Out of the swamp emerged a young man with a musket on his shoulder. Behind him came one very much older, gaunt and wrinkled, his hair as grey as the Spanish moss that overhung his path. They reached the edge of the creek, and then turned down to halt where the pirogue had been left. At failing to find it there, they argued hotly and were much distressed. Jack Cockerell's fears were calmed. These were no men of Blackbeard's company, but good Bill Saxby and his mate. He called to them from his perch, and they stood wondering at this voice from heaven. In a jiffy, Jack had slid down and was beckoning them. They hurried as fast as they could pull their feet out of the muck, and were overjoyed to jump into the hidden canoe. There they sat and thumped Jack Cockerell on the head by way of affectionate greeting. The younger man had a chubby cheek, a dimple in his chin, and blue eyes as big and round as a babe's. "Bill Saxby is me," said his pleasant voice, "and a precious job had I to get here. Joe Hawkridge told me of you, Master Cockerell." "Where is Joe?" cried Jack, dreading to hear his own opinion confirmed. "Marooned, along with 24 luckless lads that were trapped like pigeons. 'Twas more like turtles all asleepin' in the sand," the old man croaked in rusty accents. "A few was sharp awake, and they fought pretty whilst the rest rallied, but they got drove with their backs to the swamp and a deep slough. Then the sloop turned her guns on 'em, and they struck their colours." "And Joe Hawkridge sided with his friends, of course," said Jack. "Would ye expect aught else of him?" proudly answered Bill Saxby. "He searched us out where we lay trussed like fowls, all bound with ropes. We blundered fair into the camp last night, and old Trimble Rogers here, his legs knotted with cramps, couldn't make a run for it. They saved us for Blackbeard's pleasure, but he had other fish to fry." "What then?" demanded Jack. "'Twas Joe Hawkridge that ran to cutter bounds when the fight began, and he bade us leg it for the pirogue and carry word to you. A pledge of honour, he called it, to stand by his dear friend Jack, and he made us swear it." "Bless him for a Christian knight of a pirate," said Jack, with tears in his eyes. "Was he hurt? Did ye happen to note?" "We hid ourselves till the prisoners were flung into the boats. I marked Joe as one of them, and he was sprightly, barring a bloody face." "Marooned, Bill Saxby?" asked Jack. "What's your judgment on that score? It cannot be many leagues from here, or the ship would have transported them instead of the boats." "These barren islands lie strung well out from the coast, Master Cockerell. Waterless they be, and without shelter. Blackbeard's fancy is to let the men die there." "An ancient custom of buccaneers and pirates," put in old Trimble Rogers, with an air of grave authority. "I mind me in the year of 1687, when I sailed in the South Sea with that great Captain Edward Davis. 'Twas after the sack of Guayaquil, when every man had a greater weight of gold and silver than he could lug on his back." Bill Saxby interrupted in a petulant manner. "Stow it, grandsire. At a better time ye can please a lad with your long-winded yarns of marching on Panama with Henry Morgan, when the mother's milk was scarce dry on your lips." "I cruised with the best of 'em," boasted the last of the storied race of true buccaneers of the Spanish Main, "and now I be in this cheap trade of piratin'.
the fortunes I gamed away, and the plate ships I boarded. Take warning, boy, and salt your treasure down." "This Trimble Rogers will talk you deaf," said Bill Saxby, "but there's pith in his old bones and wisdom under yon hoary thatch. Captain Bonnet sent him along with me as a rare old hound to trail the swamps." In a vivid flash of remembrance, Jack Cockerell saw the salty relic of the Spanish Maine among the crew which had disported itself on the tavern green at Charlestown. The old man sitting aside with a couple of stray children upon his knees while his head nodded to the lilt of a fiddle. And again there had been a glimpse of him trudging in the column which had followed Stede Bonnet with trumpet and drum to attack the hostile Indians. Jack's heart warmed to Trimble Rogers and also to young Bill Saxby. They would find some way out of all this tribulation. "Whither lies Captain Bonnet's stout ship?" eagerly demanded Jack. "On this side the Western Ocean," smiled Saxby. "We shall waste no time in finding her. We had better bide where we are a few hours, eh, Trimble?" "Aye, and double back up the stream in the canoe to spend the night on dry land and push on afoot at dawn. If we wait to sight Blackbeard's boats come in from sea, 'twill aid us to reckon how far out they went and what the bearings are." "So Captain Bonnet may sail to pick off those poor seamen marooned," exclaimed Jack. "He is not apt to leave 'em to bleach their bones," said Bill Saxby, "and when it comes to closing in with Blackbeard, they will have a grudge of their own." They made themselves as comfortable as possible on the bottom of the pirogue. Now and then Jack climbed the live oak to look for the return of the boats. There was no more leisure for the pirates left in the ship and the sloop. Evidently Blackbeard had been alarmed by the tidings that the two of Stede Bonnet's men had been caught spying him out and had made their escape in the confusion. The sloop was now listed over in shoal water, and Bill Saxby ventured the opinion that they intended to take the mast out of her and put it in the Revenge.
"Along with most of her guns, I take it," said Trimble Rogers. "What, with losing all those men, in one way or another, this Blackbeard, as Captain Edward Teachmas calls himself, must need abandon the sloop. The more the merrier, says I, when we come at close quarters." Jack asked many curious questions by way of passing the time. The old man was easy to read. He had been a lawless sea rover in the days when there was both gold and glory in harrying Spanish towns and galleons from Mexico to Peru. The real buccaneers had vanished, but he was too old a dog to learn new tricks, and he faithfully served Stede Bonnet, who had a spark of the chivalry and manliness which had burned so brightly in that idolized master, Captain Edward Davis. As for this blue-eyed, smiling, young Bill Saxby, he had been a small tradesman in London. Through no fault of his own, he was cruelly imprisoned for debt, and after 2 years, shipped to the Carolina plantations as no better than a slave. For all he knew, the girl, wife, and child in London had been suffered to starve. He had never heard any word of them. As a fugitive, he had been taken aboard a pirate vessel. There he found kindlier treatment than honest men had ever offered him, and so grew somewhat reconciled to this wicked calling. On one of the occasions when Jack left these entertaining companions to visit his high sentry post in the tree, he surmised that all hands had been summoned on the vessel and lifting out her mast. He could see 2 boats plying back and forth and filled with none. He lingered because something else caught his interest. A little boat was putting out from the seaward side of the Revenge, and it fetched a wide circuit of the harbor. This brought the ship between it and the sloop so that its departure would be unobserved by the toiling crew. 2 men were at the oars, and a third sat in the stern. At a distance, Jack guessed they were bound to one of the nearest islands, perhaps in search of oysters or crabs. But after making a long sweep, which carried the boat out of vision of the sloop and the beach, it swung toward the shore, a little to the northward of the mouth of the creek. The errand had a stealthy air. Jack Cockerell started and almost fell out of the tree. He had been mistaken in his fancy that Blackbeard was in the pinnace which had towed the prisoners out to be marooned. This was none other than the grotesque fiend of a pirate himself, furtively steering his cockboat on some private errand of his own. As soon as he was certain of this, Jack fairly scurried down the tree, digging his toes in the bark like a squirrel, and tumbling head over heels into the pirogue. Breathing rapidly, he stuttered, The devil himself, in that little wherry of his, coming on shore. He must have seen the canoe. He is in chase of me." "Go take a look, Bill," coolly remarked old Trimble Rogers, who was busy slapping at mosquitoes. "A touch of the sun has bred a nightmare in the lad." Bill Saxby swarmed up the live oak like a limber seaman with fish hooks for fingers, and he too almost lost his balance at what he saw. He waved a warning hand at the canoe and then put his fingers to his lips. Down he came in breakneck haste, and urged the others to haul their craft farther up into the sedge. He was plucking green bushes and armfuls of dried grass to fling across the gunwales. Satisfied that the canoe was entirely concealed, they crouched low. The old man was more concerned with the pest of insects, and he reached out to claw up the sticky mud with which he plastered his face and neck like a mask. This seemed to give him some relief, and his comrades were glad to do the same. Bill Saxby was attentive to the priming of the musket, which he passed over to Trimble Rogers, saying, "You are the chief gunner, old hawk, but hold your fire. I'm itching to know what trick this Don Whiskerando is up to." "Fair enough," muttered the old man. "Captain Bonnet should clap me in irons if I slew this filthy Edward Teach and robbed him of that enjoyment. I'll pull no trigger save in our own defense." They heard the faint splash of oars. Soon the little cockboat came gliding around the bend of the shore and floated into the mouth of the creek. Bill Saxby raised himself for a moment and ducked swiftly as he whispered, "He is not looking about, but motions them to row on up the stream." "Then our canoe is not what he's after?" murmured Jack. "'Tis some queer game. Were he hunting us, he'd fetch along more hands than them too. Hush, let him pass." The little boat came steadily on, the tide helping the oars. It sat very low in the water, oddly so for the weight of 3 men. Blackbeard, hunched in the stern, held a pistol in one hand, while the other gripped the tiller. This was not in fear of danger from the shore, because he kept his eyes on the 2 seamen at the oars, and it was plain to see that the pistol was meant to menace them. The boat passed abreast of the pirogue, so artfully concealed in the pocket of a tiny cove. The intervening distance was no more than a dozen yards. Old Trimble Rogers wistfully fingered the musket and lifted it to squint along the barrel. Never was temptation more sturdily resisted. Then his face, hard as iron and puckered like dried leather, broke into a smile. The idea pleased him immensely. They would follow Blackbeard and watch a chance to take him alive. He who had trapped his own men in camp was now neatly trapped himself, his retreat cut off. Tie a couple of fathom of stout cord to his whiskers and tow him along by land, all the way to Stede Bonnet's ship. There the worthy captain could bargain with him at his own terms, silently chuckled the old buccaneer. They held their breath and gazed at the fantastic scoundrel who had made himself the ogre among pirates. He had discarded the great hat as cumbersome, and his tousled head was bound around with a white strip of the red calico from India. Still and solid he sat, like a heathen idol, staring in front of him and intent on his mysterious errand. The unseen spectators in the pirogue scanned also the 2 seamen at the oars and felt a vague pity for them. Unmistakably they were sick with fear. It was conveyed by their dejected aspect, by the tinge of pallor, by the fixity with which they regarded the cocked pistol in Blackbeard's fist. Jack Cockrell knew them as abandoned villains who had boasted of many a bloody deed, but the swarthy, pock-marked fellow had been in the boat which had saved the 2 lads from the drifting raft. This was enough to awaken a lively sympathy. Trimble Rogers gripped Jack's shoulder with a strength which made him wince, and pointed a skinny finger at the boat. The fate of the 2 seamen did not trouble him greatly. Those who live by violence should rightly expect to die by it. The sea was their gambling table, and it was their ill luck if the dice were cocked. Just then, Bill Saxby stifled an ejaculation. He too had discovered the freightage in the cockboat, the heavy burden which made it swim so low. It rested in front of Blackbeard's knees, the top showing above the curve of the gunwales. It was a sea chest, uncommonly large, built of some dark tropical wood, and strapped with iron. Old Trimble Rogers' fierce eyes glittered, and he licked his lips. He leaned over to whisper in Bill Saxby's ear the one word, "Treasure." End of Chapter 8.